Hi, in this video, we're going to take a look at physically based rendering and setting up materials so that they look good under different environments, in different softwares, and in the browser. Working with physically based materials means that you're setting up material properties such as albedo, normal, roughness, metallicness, so that the material has an accurate description of what its surface looks like. And with this description, it can then look good under different lights, in different environments, and even in different softwares. For example, we have this little shader ball here with its emerald wallpaper material. And we can see that it fits nicely into the environment. Here, we're looking at the model in the browser in Needle Engine. And it looks just as good in other softwares like Blender or Unity. And that's a big advantage of working with physically based materials, because you can be pretty sure that when you're moving them from a 3D software like Unity or Blender into the web or into another context, they're going to look very, very similar. Even when you move them to a different rendering engine like Babylon or Model Viewer, you still get the same appearance of how the surface looks and feels. And the material will continue to look realistic even if you adjust the lighting. So for example, if you increase the intensity of the environment, the material will still look as if it belongs in this scene. Or if you change out entirely how the lighting works, like what kind of reflections fall on your object. Even if we're going to like an ocean scene or a night environment. Now, depending on what kind of files and formats you work with, you usually have different material properties to work with. What's common between all of them is metallicness, roughness, the color of the object, and usually textures associated with each of these channels. And textures are typically used to control which parts of the surface have specific properties. So for example, here you can see some parts are more shiny than others. Or on this material, where the main parts are really, really glossy, and then there's little metallic pieces embedded in the texture. Then we have marble, wood with all its little grains and structure, scratched brass and gold, or even mesh structures, because you can also control the opacity of the surface, like which parts let light through and which parts don't. So this is also covered by physically based material. You can also describe glass materials, where you have translucent pieces that refract what's behind them, like in this case, or pure mirrors that reflect the environment around your scene. So here you can see in what kind of room environment. Of course, by default, you often start with something like this, where you have a flat colored material that only has very basic properties. And even the transmission of the surface can be described by textures, like in this case, where we have different parts of the model having different refraction and different transmission to them. Usually by default, you're looking at something like this, where you have a flat white or gray object that is waiting for you to adjust its material properties if you know how. And in the case of Blender or Unity, you may even start with this guy, just a regular cube. But even here, you can already see that it fits into the environment. Like it's lit from the right side, the shadow matches, and so on. So physically based rendering doesn't just mean you have a highly detailed texture surface. It also applies to just having objects that react to light in a natural way in your scene. So let's dive into how to set up these kind of materials and their properties. We're going to use Unity and Needle Engine here, but the same principles apply across other softwares. You may wonder why this particular object is being used in these scenes here. This is what's called a shader ball, and it's often used for displaying materials because it has varied surfaces. Like it has round parts, it has straight parts, it has edges and creases and so on. So it's often quite nice to use if you want to get a feel for a material without actually having the parts ready where you want to apply the material on. If I select my shader ball here, we can see that it has a material assigned, and that material has a ton of different properties. In this case, it's using a mix of map-based properties where a texture is controlling how the surface and its specific channels work. Let's start with a simple basic material here. So this shader ball has the default URP lit material assigned to it. And that material just comes with the default base color, no metallicness, and some smoothness value. So this is what these properties here are for. And we can go in here and adjust its color, and we can adjust its metalness and its smoothness. So in this way, we can turn it all the way from a rough, matte object into something mirror-like and shiny like a metal, or something like reflective plastics. And the crucial difference here is the metallicness. So let's start with a very basic material. So the shader ball here has the default URP lit material assigned to it. If you scroll down in the material section here, you can see that it has a color, metallic value, and smoothness value. And for each of them, we could also assign a texture that controls their properties. And we can already see that even though this object has a single color value for its surface, we see light and shadow and gradients coming from the environment and shining onto the object. We can also adjust its smoothness to turn this into like a very matte object. Like if you have a rough surface, it's not going to reflect a lot of light. And so it looks even and matte. But we can also increase the smoothness to get something that is very shiny, like a shiny piece of plastics. The metallic slider controls how much this material feels like a metal. The crucial difference there is that metals reflect light in a different way. They color the reflection with their own color, basically. And this is how you can differentiate between something like gold, where you can see that in the reflections are gold colored as well, and a piece of plastic that is not a metal, but also reflects the environment. So, and this is how you can differentiate between that. While metalness is a slider here, so we can adjust values to be somewhere in the middle, this doesn't actually reflect what happens in the real world. In the real world, a material is either a dielectric, which means it's a non-metal, or it's a conductor, which means it's a metal. There is no actual in between there, but still, the metalness slider is sometimes used for artistic purposes to control the reflections a little bit. Just keep in mind, physically accurate is either metallic or not. When we add textures into the mix, we can make the surfaces more interesting, have more detail. So we're going to turn this material into a scratched metal surface. And for that, I'm going to assign my brass color here. And you can see that despite this texture actually being pretty bright, the material got darker. And this is because the base map is combined with the base color. So if we want to see just the texture, we have to turn this color back to white. So now we have our brass color here, and we can see that there's a little bit of color variation. And we see that probably a bit better if we make this material rough. So there's a little bit of color variation going on in this map already. But it doesn't look like it's scratched if we turn this back to being a metal. And that's because the surface that we're seeing here is still smooth. We can make that more interesting by adding a normal map. Normals are the directions of surfaces in computer graphics. And with a normal map, we can change that from what it would be with just the geometry into something where a texture can control how the surface looks in detail. Now we can see that the surface is still smooth everywhere, so it doesn't actually look like it's scratched. For a scratched surface, you would have areas where the scratches are, where it's not as rough. We can make the surface more varied by providing a texture to control the smoothness in the areas where it should be less smooth or more rough. And for this, I have a smoothness map here, and we can plug that right into the channel here. Now we immediately see, oh, the surface got more interesting. There's parts that are still very shiny. Nothing is like a full mirror anymore. And the scratches look pretty good now because they are less smooth than the surface around it. And even if we remove our base map again, we retain this interesting property of the surface being of different grades of smoothness in different areas here. Let's change this to a different type of surface. Let's go for a marble look. For this next material, we're going to switch to a different shader. A shader is something like a representation of how the surface will work, like what kind of textures does it have, what kind of properties does it have. And we're going to switch to a shader that has more options to tune it into more varied materials later on. And the shader we're going to use is Unity GLTF PBR graph. PBR graph is a very powerful material because it accurately matches all the properties that the GLTF material model has. And that material model is pretty sophisticated because it can do all the things that I showed earlier in terms of transmission, sheen, clear coat, and adding various effects to surfaces. So let's switch our material over to that shader, and we can immediately see that we now have way more properties to work with in our material inspector here. So let's adjust for the marble material. First off, I'm going to plug in our base color. And we can see that by itself, this looks pretty wrong. For one, it's too dark because we still have a base color that is multiplied into the texture. So first, let's correct that and crank that up to white. Still, it doesn't look like good material. It looks more like a fake print because that's basically how we're describing the material right now. We say you only have a base color. Now we're going to add a roughness and metallic map. And that's one map that can represent both how metallic a surface is and how smooth a surface is in various areas. It looks like this, so it's very colorful. And for the GLTF material model, there's a specific convention which channels of the texture, like the RGB channels, relate to which property of the material. So here we have our roughness channel in green and our metallic channel in blue. And you can already see here that the metallic channel looks awfully similar to these little rectangles here because that's what's controlled by this texture. Like these areas become metallic. And we can also see them in this map where they become pretty green, which means they become very shiny. So we plugged in this roughness metallic map now, but we can still see that these pieces here don't look right. They look more like cheap plastics. And that's because here we have separate sliders for the roughness of the surface and the metallicness, and these are again multiplied with the map channels. So if we want some areas to be fully metallic, controlled by the texture, we have to put this value to 1. And we can see that these little guys here now become metallic. So now they look like they're metallic pieces in stone. These sliders are also a great way to check out what the maps actually do to your object. Because, for example, if I drag on this roughness slider, we can see which areas actually get less smooth through the use of the texture, or which areas get less or more metallic because of the texture. And we can even look at just the metallic roughness map if we remove our base color map again. And often you'll want to tune down the base color just a tad bit so that you see your surface better. So in this interesting surface does not have any base color now. It only controls its looks through that roughness metallic map. Let's bring the base color back, and let's also turn on normal maps. Normals are the directions on surfaces that influence how a surface will react to light. And a normal map can control that on a much finer level that you can do with the actual vertices and the actual mesh of your object. So often normal maps are very crucial to add details to objects. And we can see that if we add the normal map here, the surface changes again. And now it looks much more defined, like it looks like it has more structure to it. And that's because that normal map actually changes how light reacts to the surface, like which angle does the light come from and so on. And that's because the normal map actually changes how light reacts to the surface. And again, we can see this better if we remove the other maps for now. So let's remove the base color. Let's remove the roughness metallic map. And what we see now is just the effect of the normal map. And you can see that what it looks like is as if we had a different geometry here, like as if our mesh was way more complex than it actually is. If we look at the wireframe view, we can see that our sphere is pretty dense, but it does not have these lines and these areas here. So these are purely defined through that normal map. Normal maps also often have a way, like how strongly they influence the appearance of the surface. So if we turn that all the way down to 0, we can see that our normal map basically loses its effect, and we can decide how strongly we want to bring it back. And that's very useful if you have surfaces with fine details or just noisy surfaces, where you can then use the slider to control how noisy it is, turn it down a little bit and so on. Many of the materials that I showed earlier have similar ways of setting up their surfaces, where they have a base map, a roughness metallic map, and a normal map to control how they look and feel. In this one, for example, the normal maps control how flaky their surface looks. And on this one, I can also explain tiling, which is another interesting concept when we're talking about texture maps. By default, when you apply texture to an object, it just uses that object's UV coordinates. Tiling allows us to make a texture more fine-grained, more detailed on a surface. For example, to cover a wider area, like if we want to have a bigger object with a fine-grained stone texture, then we probably want this texture to be fine even when we are pretty close to the object. And in the PBR graph material, this is controlled over this toggle here, enable texture transforms. And it's on here. And for this material, it's already on. And we can see that when we turn it off and back on, we get new sliders and input fields for all these various textures. And we can actually see that the normal map here already has some tiling specified. Let's make the normal map a little bit more obvious so that we can see it better. If we now change one of these values, we can see that the texture basically slides over the object. And this way we can control whether we want this map to be applied very coarsely on the object, or if this is a very fine structure, almost like the flakes in some types of paint. Now, what's interesting is that each of these maps has its own separate tiling and offset control. So we can do something like assign a different base color and have it have its own tiling. So now we have a flaky material, but we're giving it a little bit of surface structure with the base map. Now we can adjust this separately, make it very stretchy, or also turn it into a fine surface structure. Now it almost looks like it's some rusty surface. We can of course also make it metallic again. So with these tiling options, we can produce a wide variety of materials very quickly just by adjusting how their individual textures are tiled. And in some cases that doesn't make sense. Like if you have textures that overlay important shared properties, like here, then you don't really want to have different tiling options for them because there's already a specified tiling here and the textures are designed to map exactly to each other. But if you have more structural textures like the ones we saw here, where we have a little bit of a colored structure versus some flakes, you can very well mix and match and adjust your surfaces based on that. So to summarize, we looked at how we can go from a default material that usually just has a flat gray color and maybe a little bit of smoothness to highly complex material descriptions where we combine albedo maps, normal maps, metallic and roughness maps to form one physically plausible surface. We also looked at adjusting different tiling options to combine existing maps into new kinds of materials. And in the next video, we're going to look at how we can go even further and control both the surface opacity and transmission of objects to create very diverse materials and looks. Thank you and see you in the next video.